Hello, my name is Cindy and I serve as a Justice Mobilizer for the CRC in Canada, and I'd like to welcome you to my front door. I am here on the traditional territories of the Ottawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples who have taken care of this land since time immemorial. I'm also in the riding of downtown Hamilton Centre, right in the downtown core of Hamilton, Ontario. Now, if a candidate were to come to my front door during this election season, I would ask them about their party's commitment to something that is very important to me, to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and their calls to action. At the completion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where survivors of the residential school system shared their stories, 94 calls to action were given to all Canadians that recommended ways to further reconciliation and decolonize our government, legal systems, schools, churches, and more. Calls to action 7, 8, 9, and 10 focus specifically on education, on the educational and employment gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. These calls to action have been taken on by the Christian Reformed Church's Center for Public Dialogue through the Education Together campaign. Now, why these calls to action exist is because every day children attending schools on First Nations Reserve receive on average about 30 to 50% less funding per student than their peers who are being educated off reserve. We don't think that's fair. And that means 30 to 50% less funding for books, computers, school buildings and infrastructure, and teachers who get paid less and therefore don't stay in First Nations schools very long. Now, this leads to significantly reduced graduation rates for the children who attend schools on reserve. Less than half of the students who begin grade 9 go on to complete grade 12 in First Nations schools because they don't receive the proper funding and support needed from the government for a quality education, even though the schools work very, very hard to provide that for their students. This in turn leads to lower attendance at colleges and universities, narrowed employment prospects, and results in lower incomes in First Nations communities. Now, this is not something that these communities have done wrong. It is an injustice that has been perpetuated as part of ongoing colonialism through our government systems. It is wrong and it needs to change. Now, while the federal government has long promised funding to support First Nations schools and to create Indigenous employment training programs, the funding so far has been far below what is needed, and some programs that were funded have already ended. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission also called for annual reports to be published on the funding for Indigenous education and outcomes. But in the past 6 years, since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission completed, this information has proven incomplete and really hard to find, even by the Center for Public Dialogue when it's our job to find this kind of information. So what we have found, however, working on the Education Together campaign is that in places where Indigenous communities have control over their education systems, including adequate funding, students thrive. For example, the Mi'kmaq Education Act that has been placed in Mi'kma'ki territory in Nova Scotia since 1998, in their schools, the graduation rate is 90%, and that's on par with the national average. And not only that, but by being able to focus on what's best for their own community, the Mi'kmaq Kina Matnaway education system is preserving their language in their schools, and they're creating programs that instill a pride of culture in their students. So when a local candidate or canvasser comes to my front door, I'm going to ask them, what are you and your party going to do to ensure that First Nations kids get the same education opportunities as kids who live off reserve? What are you and your party going to do to hand off power to Indigenous communities to determine their own education systems and outcomes? What are you going to do to hold your party and future governments accountable to report accurately on the funding that First Nations schools receive for education, and to demand that that funding is equitable and that the future of Indigenous kids are prioritized in Canada? If you're interested in more information on the Education Together campaign, or on finding out more about the TRC or Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, check out the links below and prepare yourself to talk to your candidate at your front door.